Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining today's web conference, EIM Governance Review Committee meeting. Please note that all participant lines will be in a listen-only mode until we reach Q&A. If you require technical assistance, please send a private note to me, the event producer, via the chat panel located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, or call our help desk at 888-796-6118. With that, I'll turn the call over to Roger Collington. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Let's start out before I turn it over to our chair. Let's start out with a roll. And we are, as I understand, some of the GRC members may be on a listen-only line. And if that's the case and we don't hear a response, you press for #2, and I understand the operator will be able to put you in. So let's start out alphabetically. Tony Braun.
Here.
Andrew Campbell.
Present.
Suzanne Cooper.
I believe we have Suzanne on the other line.
Okay.
Suzanne, your line should have been unmuted.
Suzanne, are you present?
I am present.
Excellent.
Did you hear me?
Eric Eisinger? I can hear you now. Thanks.
Present.
Thank you, Eric. Val Fong.
Here.
Angelina Galitova.
I believe she's on the attendee side.
Okay. Why don't we give a moment for #2 from Angelina, and until I hear from her, I'll continue. Jennifer Gardner.
Okay, I'm now unmuted. Yes, present.
Oh, you are here. Excellent. Glad that you're present. Jennifer Gardner.
I am here as well.
Great. Therese Hampton.
Here.
Doug Howe.
Here.
Christine Raper. Christine may be on the other line.
I think we might not have Commissioner Raper today.
Okay. We will put that as leave that blank for the moment on my checklist. Rob Taylor.
I'm here.
Rebecca Wagner.
Here.
Mary Winke.
Here.
Cameron Yurkowski.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Well, that's pretty good. We got all but Christine. So let me turn the agenda over to you, Therese.
Terrific. Thank you. If you go ahead and go to the next slide, we'll share with you the agenda for today. We're going to just do an initial opening of any public comment. If anybody has comment about anything that we're not going to cover on the agenda today, and we are going to take comment on all aspects of the scoping document and next steps, but if anybody has public comment on something not already on the agenda, now is the time. And operator, can you let them know how to indicate an interest to make a comment?
Yes. Once again, if you would like to make a comment, please dial #2 into your telephone keypad. There are no comments at this time.
Great. Okay, the next agenda item is for decision on our August 7th general session minutes. I turn it back to Roger.
Great, thanks, Therese. So we need a motion to approve the general session minutes from August 7th, 2020. And the way I like to do this one on the phone, because obviously we can't look around the room, is just get someone to give me the first on the motion.
This is Rob. I'll give you a vote first. I'll move.
That was Rob.
Yes.
And who's in second?
Tony will second.
Thank you, Tony. All right, and now I'm going to have to go through the list and get each of your votes, except for, sorry, Val and Angelina, but you're non-voting members, so I have to skip you on that. So, Tony?
Yes.
Andrew Campbell?
Yes.
Suzanne,
Yes.
Eric Eisner,
Yes.
Jennifer Gardner,
Yes.
Therese Hampton,
Yes.
Doug Howe,
Yes.
and Christine is not here. Rob Taylor,
Yes.
Rebecca,
Yes.
Mary Winke,
Yes.
and Cameron Yurkowski.
Yes.
Excellent. The motion passes. Thank you. Back to you, Therese.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, the bulk of what we're going to do today, we're going to give a little bit of a brief introduction about the process, and then we're going to hear from stakeholders on their comments that they've submitted on the straw proposal, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. If we can go to the next slide, just a little bit of context both for what we've done up until this point and then what we hope to have happen today. Back at the end of June, it was July, it's the end of July, we issued the draft straw proposal, and we identified 6 broad categories where we put our proposals forward and asked for stakeholder comment through the end of August. We received 19 sets of comments, and many of the commenters, in fact, of those, about 14 of them said they supported the straw proposal with some caveats. Some commenters didn't really say whether they supported or opposed, and we had one commenter that said they opposed with caveats. And so, as we did when we issued the initial scoping document, the Governance Review Committee really spends a lot of time with the written comments, and we will spend a lot of time with the written comments that have been submitted. But similar to what we did last time, we think it's helpful to have the opportunity to hear oral comments as well. It just gives context and color to the written comments. And so what we expect today is really to spend some time with stakeholders hearing about those caveats, whether they supported with caveats, what are those issues that are important to them that they'd like us to consider as we go through the next revision process. So the way we have this set up, we had asked for stakeholders that would be willing to provide comment, and we have, I think, 9. I think we have 9 that have been kind of raised their hand and willing to give comment. We're going to ask them to give about 5 minutes of comment, and then we're going to turn it over to the Governance Review Committee to ask clarifying questions, additional questions of the commenters, and then we'll open it up broadly. So if you're on the phone, if you did not indicate that you wanted to make a comment, but you do have information that you think would be helpful for us in our deliberative process, after we've gone through those that had volunteered to give comment, we'll open it up to everybody for comment as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps and where we go from here. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Rebecca Wagner and I are both going to facilitate the conversation here. I'm going to start, and then at a certain point, we'll pass it along to Rebecca. We do have a break planned. This, at least the way this is calendared, it's a long meeting through the afternoon, so we will take a break at about a midpoint, if that makes sense, and so we'll just keep you informed as we go along. The first presenter that we would like to hear from is Matt LaCar from PG&E.
Thanks, Therese. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Great. Yeah, so PG&E is one of those parties that supports. We have some comments. I think caveats is perhaps a little too strong. So we appreciate the straw proposal direction in terms of the joint authority and using the bright line tests for decisional classification. Those were both things that we advocated for. So on the bright line test, the proposal is not entirely clear that is what that means. But as we understand it, there will be a division of the CAISO tariff into those tariff sections that are properly under the joint authority. And we think that process of mapping the tariff will require some finesse and probably some kind of working group of parties to really do a deep dive. So that's something we would recommend the GRC, kind of look at down the road closer to a final version of the proposal. We think it will require some clarity on where EDAM is going in all its particulars. So something to pay attention to is where in the tariff the various EDAM mechanisms sit. You can't really split up the tariff until you know which pieces of the tariff fall where. So that's our first caveat, if you will. With regard to the tiebreaker mechanism, we're less comfortable than some others with the dual filing idea as a tiebreaker in the event of a deadlock between the two governing bodies. We're concerned, first of all, that may not be how FERC wants to participate in this process. Typically FERC is dealing with issues that have already been resolved in a regional transmission organization or independent system operator organization. So, we're concerned that we're really kicking the can or, punting issues to FERC to decide that are more properly, adjudicated among stakeholders within the West. And then the second challenge becomes, let's say that there is an issue that goes with dual filings. There's staffing and resource constraints at the ISO. You only have, typically so many initiative leads and lawyers. All of the preparation, all of the litigation or settlement that has to occur throughout the FERC process will require both points of view to be defended. And we have a hard time seeing how you would, sort of segregate and put in place firewalls between CAISO staff working on one side versus the other. Perhaps, there's a different vision where the governing body has its own staff. I'm not sure. That's something that, the GRC should give some thought to. So on a couple of minor issues, I'm almost done. Or what we would consider less critical issues, the question of funding support for the BOSR. We did join with other state-regulated parties in supporting a funding mechanism rather than through the ISO tariff. We would have it be kind of a voluntary opt-in structure that would, be invoiced to those parties that opt in. And, we're confident that a way can be found to pay for that as long as the BOSR is supportive. And then one further item where we're, I guess, out of step with some parties is we're not big fans of the additional outside market experts for only EIM issues. That seems to not make sense in a joint shared market where we already have a market surveillance committee and a Department of Market Monitoring that are very aware of everything that's going on within the EIM today. I think it simply makes sense for those entities to expand their scope and cover, all of the interests of the larger EIM and EDAM footprint in the future. So we're not totally against the outside market expert. It just seems unnecessary given the resources that already exist and kind of duplicative. And we did say, if there are enough voluntary participants who want to support that function, they're certainly welcome to do so, and it should be paid for on a voluntary basis. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Thanks, Matt. So I'll open it to Governance Review Committee members. Do you have questions for Matt? Clarifying questions, additional questions?
I have a question, Therese. This is Mary.
Go right ahead.
So I'm just curious, you mentioned the, not being comfortable with the dual filings at FERC. And I think there is some drawbacks to that approach. And I'm just curious if you have kind of an alternative that you think would work better or preferred approach other than that to kind of deal with the issue of that kind of deal breaker or tiebreaker situation.
Yeah, there were several other alternative tiebreakers that were suggested both in, I think, in our initial issue paper comments and then also in the straw proposal. So, I think we would be willing to look at either a, subcommittee formed of, members of both bodies, with an odd number so they can reach a decision, whether that's by random draw or, potentially there's a neutral party that serves as the odd number maker. I guess one perspective that I'd like to share more generally is I think the GRC proposal may be overestimating the degree to which the tensions within the ISO market generally, contentious issues that come before either governance today rarely cleave along purely geographic lines. And so I think the likelier scenario, what we tend to see today is, you have generators versus load, or you have, regulated participants versus unregulated participants. There are lots of different ways in which the diversity of stakeholder interests manifests itself today. And so I'm hopeful that the instances in which, all of the EIM community feels one way about something and all of the ISO community in California feels a different way about it, those instances will be rare. But the importance of having a tiebreaker established and on the books is to reinforce trust. And so I think we need a mechanism that builds upon the trust of the parties to resolve their own issues within their own forums rather than kicking it out to some, external referee to make a call when we can't do it ourselves.
Therese, this is Val. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Matt. Thank you for being here. And Eric, too, from PG&E. So I want to just go a little bit more about the outside market expert, the OME. Is PG&E's concern really around funding because you think this is duplicative, or would PG&E be open to the concept of the OME with the understanding that that there are some geographic lines between California and non-California, in particular between California IOUs and non-California, non-IOUs and non-California IOUs, that seek some level of comfort with having an OME. I'm wondering. Go ahead.
So it's not purely a funding issue. I think part of it is a confusion of roles and having sort of too many chefs in the kitchen. I think it would be helpful. I think that the profile of expert that proponents are looking for in the OME is very much the profile that we have on the existing Market Surveillance Committee. In fact, many, as I point out in our comments, many of the members of the Market Surveillance Committee, do a great deal of their work outside of California and are happy to share perspectives and benchmark our market rules against market rules from other multi-state RTOs around the country. And that's been very helpful, as balancing area participants. But it makes perfect sense to me that the EIM community's views should be incorporated in selecting members of the Market Surveillance Committee and to leverage that existing institution rather than, again, fostering distrust by having a situation where, you have dueling experts and it becomes like, expert testimony in a court of law where, I pay the guy who says what I want him to say and you pay the guy who pays you, says what you want to say, which is not at all how, we view the both the DMM and the MSC to roll today. So I think the independence exists. We ought to reinforce it and make sure that it serves the interests of all shared market participants in a multi-state market.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions from the GRC?
Therese, this is Andy.
Great.
Hey, Matt, thanks for presenting. A question about the bright line test. Kind of when and who do you think should be working through the details of defining that line? Are you recommending the GRC do that prior to a final GRC recommendation, or is that kind of a post GRC task with a different working group? Do you have thoughts on that?
I think it can't be finalized until more is known about the draft EDAM tariff language, unless there's a commitment from the CAISO as to where they will put. The EDAM process is really, it's in first bucket of several buckets. There will be a whole bunch of likely, if EDAM is to go forward, a whole bunch of tariff changes that may reside throughout the CAISO tariff. And so unless there is a, single section that is designated, here's where all the EDAM rules go, which is one possibility, then we would expect different sections to contain both CAISO balancing area and new EDAM tariff language, and it will be necessary to go through and subdivide those particular sections to ensure that we're mapping them. So I think there is I have a clearer picture of when this process has to end than when it needs to begin. I think you could begin now and map maybe 80% of the tariff that's not going to change with EDAM. So I'm not proposing a specific schedule. I do think it would behoove the GRC to think about the who question. Who do we want sitting on this working group or subcommittee? It could be composed of GRC members, but could also include stakeholders. It's probably helpful to have some folks who really know the tariff well dig through it all because it's quite lengthy.
Matt, I have a follow-up question to this. Is this something that you just think is good governance, or do you have concern that if we don't do this, that there will be areas of conflict that haven't been addressed?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think it's both. So I think that, for example, there is change coming via the EDAM process potentially to transmission cost allocation on the interties, but not within the balancing area. So today there's a section of the tariff that deals with transmission cost allocation. Tomorrow there will need to be two separate sections. They may reside within the same chapter, if you will, but it would certainly cause tension if there were EDAM market rules and the governing body did not have a voice in how those were updated and changed over time. So, that the EDAM section properly belongs to the joint authority and would be remiss if we sort of chop the tariff into the wrong slices, right? Down the road, we would be pointing changes in those tariff sections to the wrong decisional authority.
If I may just interrupt briefly, and I understand that Christine Raper has joined the conference. Right.
Thank you.
Correct. You're there? Okay,
sure.
great. Okay, thanks. We'll reflect that in the minute that you've joined.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Hey, that's okay. Any additional questions for Matt?
Hey, Therese, it's Tony. Got room for one more? I feel like we're peppering Matt right out of the box here.
Yes.
Matt, PG&E's written comments had this sort of reversionary construct in it where if a certain critical mass yet to be defined of EIM or EDM entities exited, that there would be a sort of a reinstatement of prior governance rules. Can you expound upon that a little bit?
So here, I think we are attempting to channel some of what we have heard from other California parties, and Tony's you've been privy to some of that discussion. So this goes back to some early foundational conversation about the fact that EDAM participation, as is EIM participation today, will be a voluntary construct. For the California participating entities, it is not voluntary. to be a full member of the ISO. In fact, we have made, massive investments, and it would be extremely unwieldy for us to ever withdraw. We have no intention to ever withdraw. So in reflection of that, in a scenario where there were essentially a failure of the EDAM marketplace and a wide-scale defection, we would need a means to retake our balancing area authority under our own California control. So how that takes place and under what criteria, what the sort of threshold of total market failure looks like, I didn't want to be too explicit about. But I think you could construct, a set of rules. So, the concern was, if there's even 1 megawatt participating from a given state, or 1 kilowatt participating from a given state, is that enough to retain the joint shared governance? That seems a bit absurd. So there is some threshold of participation that would trigger this reversion to the pre-existing balancing area control over the governance. And that's really, implicit in the CAISO retaining, under its California corporate status, control of the institution.
Thanks, Matt. Any other questions for Matt? Okay.
Therese,
that was really
Doug.
Oh, go ahead, Doug.
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button there. Matt, on your last response to Tony about this trigger for unwinding the EIM or the EDAM, I get completely what you're saying, that there has to be some point at which it becomes a California-only institution again. But finding what that trigger is sounds to me like it would be kind of problematic, and it might be very hard to specify exactly a kilowatt or a megawatt hour sort of level that would work. And as a practical matter, I think CAISO and the members would work very hard to fix whatever defects happened before a complete failure of the market were allowed to descend on it. But given that there's always that possibility, can you, articulate, has anyone at PG&E given any thought as to what a trigger for the unwinding event would be? And if not, would some kind of unspecified trigger work? I'm not sure how that would work, but have you given any thought to that?
No, I think it should be a specified trigger, and it's probably more than just a majority of states withdrawing from the, of non-California participants withdrawing. It's some kind of supermajority close to total market departure. You could set a trigger based on percentage of load or number of entities. I haven't given it that level of thought, but it should be quite a high bar, right? And we're really talking about a scenario in which, something terribly wrong has occurred in the marketplace. There are probably, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of unintended costs, and, we do not want California entities to be left holding the bag for broken market rules as we were 20 years ago. This is not a hypothetical for us. We have had this experience of a market failure in California, and there are still wounds from the 2001 energy crisis. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy, I think, to have informal conversation, and perhaps in a next iteration we can put forward a more coherent proposal on this. But yeah, I do think it's important to the silent or less vocal California parties that we've been talking to, that there be some mechanism to ultimately retain control of our institution, in the event that all of all or substantially all of the voluntary parties depart, and only those parties who rely upon the ISO to provide their balancing area services remain.
Okay. Thanks again, Matt. I'm gonna wait just one more minute to see if any GOC members have any last questions for you. Okay, we're gonna transition to Tuli Hakala from Chelan PUD.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Tuli. How's my audio?
Very good.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to provide some comments today. I'm going to take this time to expand on our comments, our written comments on durability specifically. I'm going to focus mainly on the emergency tariff filing process and then touch on a couple other points as well. We view the emergency tariff filing process as being a pretty important component of...
Hello?
We see the emergency tariff filing process to be a pretty important part of governance durability, and that's because it allows for a temporary deviation from the protections that are provided by joint authority decision-making as they're envisioned in the GRC straw proposal. We acknowledge that there needs to be some process in place that lets CAISO act quickly and in a timely manner if there is a true exigency and if that exigency needs to be addressed through a tariff amendment. However, we think that process needs to be crafted as narrowly as possible. If it isn't, we think it creates a risk that that emergency process could be utilized as a workaround to regular joint decision making. We put some ideas in our written comments on how we think the emergency tariff filing process could be revised to make it more narrow and to make it more I'd say consistent with the spirit of joint authority. We think that even if there are exigent circumstances occurring, it should be feasible to assemble quorums of both the CAISO board and the governing body pretty quickly after any emergency tariff amendment is developed and filed with FERC. We think particularly with remote meeting capabilities, we think this could be done within a week of when CAISO has filed something with FERC. We think at that time, the two bodies could be asked to review that emergency filing, and they could take essentially one of three actions. One, they could affirm it, and if they affirmed it, there would be no need to follow up with FERC, or they could reject it or modify it. Either they could change the language of the tariff amendment or change the term of it, perhaps shorten it or lengthen it. And if they opted to either reject it or modify it, then there would be a need to have a follow-up filing with FERC, which would happen immediately after the two bodies made that decision. And we think we could build in an additional layer of protection that when CAISO files that initial tariff amendment with FERC, it could be drafted so that it only goes into effect if the two bodies affirm it. We think this concept would strike the balance of letting CAISO act quickly and give them flexibility to develop a tariff amendment in reaction to an exigency, get it out the door, file that with FERC, but still preserve the role of joint authority review for all tariff amendments. We think 90 days is a significant length of time for market participants to be subject to any tariff language, emergency or not, if it's not a product of joint authority decision making. I'm going to shift a little bit here and touch quickly on another element of durability that we discussed in our comments. We believe that there should be a dispute resolution mechanism process in place that would deal with governance design disputes. In our comments, we recommended that we use the model that we're looking at for market rule design disputes, which is to have FERC review. We understand that Public Generating Pool is going to go into a little bit more detail on that concept in their comments, and so I just wanted to mention that that's important to us, and we think that's an important component of durability. And then finally, I know I'm running out of time here, I'm going to touch just real briefly on stakeholder concerns that were raised in written comments about the distinction between mandatory and voluntary market participation and how that might necessitate different treatment in governance. And we suspect that the commonality we all have is that everyone wants to ensure that their interests are adequately represented in the market decision-making process, and it's of course up to each entity to make that determination on whether they think that has been met or not. We think that the governing body's charter and the stakeholder-driven selection process for members results in a decision-making body that doesn't have a structural or a political or a legal bias towards any particular set of interests. And so we view the governing body as being, as currently chartered and as envisioned in the GRC straw proposal, as being adequately representative of the full market footprint. With respect to the CAISO Board of Governors, we understand that they have a California statutory mandate to protect California ratepayers. Shalana's had some brief discussions with CAISO legal counsel, and we understand that CAISO's view is that you really have to view that mandate through the lens of the Federal Power Act and the Federal Power Act non-discrimination requirements, and that those requirements would restrict how the CAISO would fulfill that mandate in the context of a multi-state market like EIM or EDAM. We think it would be beneficial for all of us to have more conversation about that legal issue and others, and so we want to reiterate that we support the Public Power Council's request for additional information that they put in their written comments. And that's, I will close it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuli. So to the GRC, questions for Tuli. Clarifying questions, additional information. Okay, I don't hear any. I think I've waited the appropriate amount of time. I've given consistent, long enough pause. Thank you, Tuli, very much for your comments. And we'll transition now to Commissioner Tani from the Body of State Regulators. Commissioner Tani.
Good afternoon. Checking my audio. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Wonderful. Well, first, I'd really like to thank the Governance Review Committee for this opportunity today to provide verbal comments. Like many of you, we're enduring the umpteenth day of heavy smoke and have enormous work to do to rebuild communities across the West and across Oregon right now. So, but this process is critical, and so I'm glad we're doing this today, and bear with the scratchy voice. I'm Letha Tani. I'm the Body of State Regulators Chair. And with the rapid expansion of the EIM, the BOSSR is well on its way to including public utilities commissioners from every state in the Western Interconnection at this point. A real commentary on the success of the EIM, I think. One of the BOSSR's responsibilities is to express a common position where possible in the CAISO stakeholder processes like this. And we've submitted consensus comments in each phase of this process so far. The written comments submitted by the BOSSR represent our hard work to come to consensus views, and any comments I make here today that go beyond those written comments are my own. I'd like to thank the members of the GRC for their hard work on getting to really a thoughtful and comprehensive straw proposal. And I'd really like to acknowledge and thank Commissioner Raper for her time and commitment to this process as the BOSSR representative. She's put in a lot of hours, and we really appreciate that. The BOSSR generally supports the GRC straw proposal. It appears to offer, in our view, a reasonable and balanced approach to governance while working within the limits posed by the delegation model. And it sets a good framework for the issues that still need to be resolved. I'm going to address topics in my comments today, and I look forward to your questions. The delegation of authority to the EIM governing body, BOSSR funding, the public power liaisons to the BOSSR, and transparency and inclusiveness. Consistent with our previous comments, the BOSSR supports the GRC's recommendation for joint authority between the EIM governing body and the CAISO board. The proposed joint authority is a significant improvement over the complicated and subjective process that's now used to determine if the EIM governing body has primary authority over a subset of issues. It avoids the potential to lead to procedural conflicts and unexpected outcomes, and really reflects, we think, the reality that the EIM is inseparable from the real-time market. We also agree with the GRC's recommendation that the two governing bodies meet jointly to discuss and vote on proposed market changes. This is both efficient, but also we think really will encourage collaboration and promote cohesion and common understanding between the two bodies. We support the durability provisions recommended by the GRC as they're an effort to provide additional confidence to participants in the market. And we generally support the dispute resolution process. The recommendation in particular for at least 2 attempts to resolve a deadlock before taking any additional steps is positive. In our view, a compromise reached by Western stakeholders is more desirable and is likely to be more positively received by stakeholders across the region than an option sort of selected by a federal regulatory body. I think important questions have been raised. We've heard them already, some of them already this afternoon, about the advisability of submitting 2 alternative proposals to FERC. Beyond these, the GRC should consider changes that would lead to additional attempts to resolve issues at the regional level, although I will note we have not put forward a proposal on what that would look like, just would encourage efforts in that direction. The GRC should also, I think, consider a process for deadlocks between the 2 governing bodies for market design or rule changes that are outside the category of quote, changes that are clearly needed. And we look forward to fully vetting all these important issues as the GRC moves forward. Based on the comments to the straw proposal, there is largely alignment on the overall benefit of providing financial support to the BOSSR, and we appreciate that. The long-term stability of the market will be enhanced with sustained and informed engagement by the BOSSR and policy initiatives. I think questions remain as to an appropriate and equitable funding mechanism. We the BOSSR recommends that funding to support this important role should be allocated among all the state jurisdictional utilities participating in the EIM. So exactly how, I think, remains a point of discussion. The BOSSR is also still in discussion around the appropriate mechanism. There are 2 primary options being discussed. First, the funds could be collected through a component of the grid management charge charged just to specific entities. That would be implemented through the CAISO tariffs. Second, the funds could be collected through an out-of-market agreement with the EIM, IOUs, as PG&E mentioned. There are advantages to both of these options. For example, from our view, the GMC is administratively efficient, durable, stable, transparent, and preserves the BOSSR's independence. The EIM IOUs, the SRMP proposal, was recently, just on Friday, presented to the BOSSR during our last monthly call, and we really appreciate their engagement with the BOSSR in the process of carefully considering their views. Further, we look forward to having these ideas fully vetted by the GRC process, as well as any other options that stakeholders would like to have considered. The GRC asks in the straw proposal the BOSSR to consider establishing a limited number of non-voting liaison positions for public power entities that participate in the EIM. And by public power, I mean both the federal power marketing administrations, the PMAs, and the publicly owned or consumer-owned utilities, the POUs. This recommendation differs from the others in the straw proposal because it would require an amendment to the Boxer Charter, which can only be accomplished by the Boxer. The Boxer recognizes the value of public power perspective and is conducting discussions about the potential for 2 liaisons. The liaisons would be invited to participate actively in Boxer meetings, which are in general open to the public anyway, but to actively participate. The liaisons would not only be able to inform public power of the Boxer's position, but we think importantly, provide the Boxer membership with public power's perspective. The Boxer will continue to collaborate with the public power representatives and other stakeholders on the details of the selection process and other aspects of the liaison positions. And we really welcome comments through this governance review process. Finally, the Boxer consistently maintains that transparency and inclusiveness are key principles for any healthy and constructive governance or stakeholder process. In the last round of comments, the Boxer recommended that the GRC clearly articulate the criteria for its use of closed executive sessions. The straw proposal sets forth a clear and reasonable standard, the CAISO bylaws and open meeting policy. Application of this standard should lead to minimal use of closed executive sessions. And from our view, the more open the process, the more legitimacy that process has. So again, the Boxer really commends the GRC for hard work on this proposal in a challenging setting for coming to agreement. And we really look forward to continued engagement on the development of the final proposal. And I stand ready for your questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Commissioner Tani. Questions from the GRC members?
Teresa, this is Tony. I have one. Commissioner Tani, on the thank you for making time to do this. On the issue of the public power advisory role in the Boxer, how do we link? What are your suggestions for how we link up our processes here? As you note, the charter is something that's that you guys have been discussing and potential amendments to it. Obviously, we're crafting an overall comprehensive governance proposal. How do we marry those processes up so we don't have misalignment?
I appreciate that. It's an important question, and I think as we work through the fall towards the seeing the second stakeholder or the second straw proposal, I think we're continuing conversation inside the Boxer. And I think I look to Commissioner Raper to keep me and Chair Fornstrom as the Vice Chair of the Boxer really informed on where we need to be, where the decision points are, and where we need to be communicating something more firm back into the process. So I think there's routes for dialogue and routes for knowing when those sort of decision points are arriving. But in terms of doing our homework, we've been engaging with the Boxer members to build that consensus since the straw proposal has emerged, so that we're ready. And we're uncovering whether there are concerns and what those concerns might be early and in time to address them.
Other questions? Commissioner Tani, I have a question about the comment you made relative to dispute resolution, and I think what I heard you say is think it would really be preferable to come to resolution within the region rather than from a regulatory agency outside the region. Is that just to suggest that's an interest if we can find something like that? Is the Boxer opposed to what's in the document now, or just encouraging us to see if there is an alternative?
At this phase, from what I have heard in our conversations, it is encouraging you to keep looking for solutions in the region. We have not posed the question so bluntly to the BOSSER members, but we can continue to frame up that question and explore how firm folks are on that front in our conversations, if that's helpful to you.
Great, thank you. I think the comments were comparable to what we heard from Matt. I think in the same way of encouraging an alternative consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Commissioner Tony, thank you so much for your comments and for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Next, we will transition to Jennifer Gardner, who will provide comments from the public interest organizations on behalf of the public interest organizations.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Therese. Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Gardner. I'm with Western Resource Advocates. I am a member of the Governance Review Committee, but I wear a couple of different hats. So these remarks should be narrowly construed in my role as representing a certain coalition of public interest organizations who are interested in the ongoing governance review being performed by the GRC. And so, sorry, I'm just looking at my dog just walked into the office and surprised me. Anyway, so in this role, I am currently representing Western Resource Advocates, Western Grid Group, and Northwest Energy Coalition. We did overwhelmingly support the GRC's recommendation with some minor caveats. And one of those caveats that I wanted to speak to today is the process for resolving deadlocks within the joint authority model. And within that process for resolving deadlocks, we appreciated the effort that the GRC made to propose a process that could really have the best chance of having both boards reach a mutually agreeable decision regarding future tariff changes. We appreciated that there would be at least 2 attempts to reach agreement before considering the option of filing 2 alternative versions before FERC. I think where we have concerns is the uncertainty that might be created where we end up in a situation where we do actually have 2 alternative proposals before FERC. In our comments, we highlight the process that is used by ISO New England today, where they have what's called a jump ball provision within their governance framework. Under that model, if stakeholders within the ISO New England stakeholder process obtain at least a 60% vote in favor of their own market rule proposal, then the jump ball provision requires ISO New England to file it on equal footing with the ISO New England's own proposal. So up until fairly recently, FERC had a great degree of flexibility in how they would consider those 2 competing filings under the jump ball provision. So they could approve ISO New England's version of the proposal, or they could approve the stakeholders' version of the proposal. If FERC found neither proposal to be just and reasonable, they could actually create their own version by basically picking and choosing elements of each and approving an entirely different version of the proposal. This could be called sort of the Frankenstein version of the proposal. I think another article had called it the restaurant menu approach, where FERC gets to pick and choose the elements that it prefers. Now, there was a recent decision at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that seems to clarify that FERC doesn't have nearly that level of flexibility with Section 205 filings that it once believed that it did have. And so perhaps the uncertainty on competing filings is not so uncertain going forward. In that decision, that was the Energy Power Marketing decision from 2017, FERC essentially said that, the D.C. Circuit essentially said that FERC can make minor changes to a Section 205 rate proposal but cannot make material changes that would result in an entirely different rate design. So I think that going forward, it would be unlikely that we would see FERC actually pick and choose or mix and match different elements of competing filings, but it is still unclear what level of flexibility they might have with these filings. And so we were just concerned at the uncertainty that this creates, and we really wanted any type of competing filings to be avoided wherever possible. We also suggested that to sort of create more of a burden where competing filings are used, that CAISO includes certain language in a filing where they actually acknowledge that the EIM governing body has a competing filing, that they provide enough detail regarding that filing to enable a fair determination by FERC, and that they also sufficiently justify their reasoning for failing to adopt the governing body's alternative. So basically elevating the burden there of doing the competing filings and making sure that both filings really are being presented to FERC on equal footing. And so that is a summary of some of the concerns and the recommendations that we made under the process for resolving deadlocks, and I would be happy to take any questions at this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Questions from the group? Okay. I don't hear any. I think we have two options. We can break early, or I can just take one from the other panel, and then we'll take a break after that. I think I'll go ahead and take one from the other panel. Becky's shaking her head. That's what I was looking for. Okay, so we will hear from David Rubin from the EIM entities.
Thanks, Therese. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, sure. Great. Well, on behalf of the EIM entities, I want to thank the GRC members for their service and for the preparation of the July 31st draft straw proposal, which represents a thoughtful and balanced approach to the governance issues. Our joint comments were submitted on behalf of a diverse group of 18 EIM entities, including all 10 of the currently active EIM entities. The EIM entities strongly support the draft proposal as a comprehensive package that represents a significant step forward in enhancing independent governance of the EIM and the potential expansion to EDAM within the boundaries of existing California law. Indeed, we hope the GRC would feel confident enough in the proposal to potentially expedite the schedule so that the reforms could be implemented by the end of 2020 or early into next year. I'll highlight just a couple of elements of our comments and make one correction. We strongly support the proposed joint authority model as a significant improvement to the current governance structure. Experience has shown that the current approach has significant limitations. The scope of issues within the governing body's primary authority is narrow, as most initiatives relate to the real-time market as a whole. However, issues of general applicability may affect the EIM entities differently. We agree that the joint authority will be easier to implement and provides greater confidence that the governance structure represents the market as a whole. EIM entities support the proposed majority voting structure and appreciate the need for a dispute resolution process. In response to the request for comments on the dispute resolution process, we offer a couple of suggestions. Most significantly, we propose that there just be a single remand to the stakeholder process. And the reason for this is that it really takes a long time from when an initiative is sort of first brought to the stakeholders before it then goes through the whole process, the tariff drafting, and then gets to the boards for a vote. The old adage of justice delayed is justice denied can come into play because even a single remand may add just a half a year or more to the process. We strongly support the concept of the dual Section 205 filings. We believe this can and should be done in both a situation where there are two separate proposals we're in the situation where one body wants to move forward with a tariff amendment and the other wants to preserve the status quo. In other words, neither body should be able to have a veto. And to address the issue that Jennifer Gardner was just discussing about FERC's discretion, the way we proposed some language there, it was to give FERC a choice between one of the two proposals, but to take away FERC's discretion to create Frankenstein. We support the recommendations with respect to durability and the improvements to the governing body selection process, and we recognize the cooperative approach in which the nominating committee has exercised its responsibilities to date. We support the recommendation that the Regional Issues Forum be permitted to discuss matters that are part of ongoing stakeholder processes. As to the makeup of the RIF, we propose some limited revisions that recognize past practice as well as the significant geographic expansion of the EIM. And because of that expansion, our primary thought was to reduce the neighboring balancing authority sector from 2 to 1, with the recommendation that we include an EIM entity that is not necessarily a transmission owner or in the future potentially an EDAM participating entity. With respect to the BOSSR, the GRC recommends that representatives from federal power marketing agencies and consumer-owned utilities be permitted to participate as non-voting liaisons. We don't oppose that recommendation, but believe the issue should be decided by the BOSSR as it relates to the BOSSR charter. And as to the important issue of BOSSR funding, I'll defer any comments on that to Ali Kozlow, who will be discussing it on behalf of the state-regulated market participants. I'd also note the recent materials from the discussion at the September 11th BOSSR meeting. With respect to market monitoring, the EIM entities support the recommendation for the governing body member would have an advisory role on the DMM Oversight Committee, that the governing body would have joint authority to approve members of the MFC, and that if EDAM moves forward, the governing body would have access to an outside market expert. In the last paragraph of our comments on market monitoring, the EIM entities noted that in the EIM only scenario, the GRC recommends leaving it to the governing body to propose the use of an outside market expert. While the EIM entities support this approach, the concept we were trying to convey is that in light of the summer's events, it may be beneficial to proceed with the retention of the outside market expert. The use of the term in our comments, independent market monitor, was a mistake, and I apologize for any confusion that this may have caused. Finally, the EIM entities support the proposal for reevaluation no later than 5 years after the adoption of the new governance policy, and the suggestion that the GRC remain available for further evaluation prior to implementation of the EDAM market design. Thank you again for the opportunity to be virtually here, and I'd be happy to address any questions.
Great. Thank you, David. Questions?
David, this is Rob Taylor. Just I was hoping you could respond to PG&E's suggestion regarding the market expert of just expanding the existing role of either the market monitor or, I guess more specifically, the surveillance committee, and whether or not that would address the EIM entity's concerns.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure on this outside market expert who hasn't come in yet to have different hats. I certainly recognize that there's a lot of expertise on the GRC, a lot of experience with other RTOs. There's one gap that at least I think the EIM entities perceive to be there, is experience in the bilateral markets, especially in the West, where we're trying to sort of merge our current practices and historic practices into the market structure. So we do certainly want somebody who has expertise in best practices in organized markets to provide some additional expertise. but we certainly also want somebody with that background in the West in particular to bring that perspective into the discussion, given that there's been sort of a whole lot of history with the Cal-ISO tariff and the ISO market, but we're trying to sort of merge those two existing structures into a new day-ahead process, as well as continuation with the EIM. So I think that's some of the reason there. Maybe after the 5-year period that is part of the proposal, you can begin to phase it out as those other, the DMM and the MSC could take it over. That's certainly part of it. The other part of it, though, is in the foundation of these markets, and EIM had some hiccups in the beginning, and no market is ever finalized. But we certainly thought that it may be helpful for the members of the governing body to just have access to somebody that they could, in effect, call their own to help with the analysis of the expertise being conveyed by the MSC, DMM, other market participants, and Cal-ISO staff. So I think that was some of the background there, Rob.
Thanks. That's helpful.
This is Andy. I have a question on the same topic.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, David. So you mentioned the August events. I guess, why do you, and it's a bit early in terms of the sort of investigation of those events, but why do you think that those events could potentially call for an OME being brought on board sooner? Thanks.
Well, and to be fair, I think, a lot of us would have wanted it to be there now, regardless of any challenges that this summer has presented. But I do think the summer is going to require all of us, not just California and the California ISO market, but certainly throughout the region, to look at challenging issues, RA, resource efficiency, price formation, transmission availability, and really see how the market design will react to both normal and the signs of stress test conditions. And so bringing in somebody now to sort of get involved in the process, both any improvements to the EIM and now through the EDAM stakeholder process, I think would be potentially helpful.
Thanks.
David, I have a clarifying question related to the dispute resolution, where I think you suggested just one remand. And I want to make sure I understand. I think the way we wrote it, and maybe it's that we would go through the process once, and if we couldn't get to resolution, then you would go through the process again before you go to the FERC jump ball. So there's 2 iterations through the process. Is that, when you say one remand, do you mean the same thing?
Yeah.
2 full iterations?
I do, and I apologize if we were misreading it. So I think when we read twice, we read it to be, you go through the process, if there's a dispute, it's taken back to the stakeholder process, and then if you go forward again, if it's still in dispute, you go back again. If that's not what we meant, then we're all on the same page. And again, I certainly want to emphasize complete agreement with Matt and Commissioner Tawney that, the preference here is for the stakeholder process in the West to come up with a sort of a joint proposal. We certainly feel that, and that may be one of the reasons that it would be great to have Vassar with the funding and more involved in the stakeholder process, to have their views incorporated in it. And so the challenge that we felt was that going back that second time certainly adds, half a year to an already, 2 year process. And there are times where, you know, a market participant, clearly if they feel that the design becomes unjust and unreasonable, may bring it to FERC's attention anyway. And we don't want to, it was sort of our way of not taking it out of the West, but trying to force the West to deal with it in that second pass.
Thanks. Other questions? Okay, I don't hear any. It's 2:20. Let's go ahead and take a break, and then let's come back at 2:30, and we'll start. We've got 5 more stakeholders that have prepared comments. And again, just a reminder to those that are on the phone, we will open it up to you if you have additional comments or clarifications you would like for us to have for our benefit of deliberation. So we will be back at 2:30. We have our GRC members back. Thank you for those that are rejoining by video. I can see you. I'm going to hand this portion of the agenda to Rebecca to facilitate the next panel.
Thanks, Therese.
About everyone back.
Yeah.
Okay, Rebecca, go ahead.
I just want to make sure our next person up is from the California PUC Public Advocate's Office, Chloe Lukens. Are you there? Oh, great. And Chloe, I haven't heard your voice yet.
Operator, do you see Chloe? I don't. She was on previously. She's. So I can see her there. Are we having muting issues?
If Chloe can just check to make sure that her line is not muted.
Rebecca, do you want to go to the next presenter until we can?
Okay, Chloe, one last shot. Can you unmute? Okay. And I have a request from.
Hello, this is Chloe. Can you hear me? I didn't do anything. It just said I'm now unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Should I go now?
Yes, please. Go for it.
All right. All right. Good afternoon, and thank you for letting me speak today. I would like to thank the EIM Governing Review Committee for their good work on the straw proposal. My name is Chloe Lukens, and I'm a program manager at the Public Advocate's Office at the California Public Utilities Commission. We are an independent consumer advocate in California with a mandate to obtain the lowest possible rates for utility services, consistent with safe and reliable levels, and to meet the state's environmental goals. I'm here to comment on 5 topics on the straw proposal. Can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. For the proposed joint authority model, the Public Advocate's Office recommends no change to the current delegation of authority and opposes the proposed joint authority model. Currently, the participating transmission owners who gave operational control to the CAISO pay into the Grid Management Charge, or GMC, while the EIM entity's participation in the real-time market is voluntary and they do not pay into the GMC. Also, if the Extended Day-Ahead Market, or EDAM, moves forward, the EIM GRC straw proposal recommends that the EIM participants' participation in EDAM will also continue to be voluntary. The EIM governing body and the CAISO board meetings provide reasonable opportunities for collaboration on a regular basis. Therefore, it's not clear what the added value will be of the joint authority model proposal. In addition, the proposal may be duplicative of the CAISO board's functions in providing oversight of EIM market rules, structure, and design. However, if the joint authority model goes forward, the CAISO and the EIM Governing Review Committee should provide detailed cost information and analysis of how much the joint authority model will cost California ratepayers and how the additional costs will be funded. The next topic I'd like to briefly discuss is the proposal for an outside market expert. The EIM governing body's need for additional outside market experts should be clarified, particularly since the CAISO board has access to the Market Surveillance Committee, or MSC, Department of Market Monitoring, or DMM, and the CAISO stakeholders meetings and workshops that assist stakeholders in understanding the CAISO's market designs and market issues. Given that the MSC and EIM information are available to the KISO board and can be shared with the EIM governing body, it's unclear what other expertise the EIM governing body needs. Hiring an outside expert to assist the EIM governing body in understanding market issues seems like it could duplicate the KISO's current efforts in apprising and educating stakeholders on market issues and designs. However, one alternative to hiring an outside expert is to have a fourth MSC member who can be added and be from an EIM participants region, which should be paid for by the EIM participants. Our third recommendation is that the Public Advocate's Office supports the public interest group having a voting seat on the EIM governing body, because they could provide the perspective of cost impacts to consumers and public interest issues such as environmental safety and reliability impacts. However, the Public Advocate's Office requests information on how the voting will work with 6 voting members instead of 5, with a potential 3-3 tie vote on an issue. One approach to addressing this potential outcome is that the KISO board, as the primary oversight board on EIM matters, could step in and break a 3-3 tie vote on an issue. However, there should be a forum in which stakeholders can participate to discuss options for voting procedures. In addition, we support a diverse membership of the EIM governing body because it will provide a diverse perspective from various geographic regions and sectors that the KISO may serve. For example, members can be from a rural, urban, coastal, or mountain region, or from a consumer group, disadvantaged community, or a utility. And finally, we request that the KISO provides benefit cost analysis that supports the proposal that the EIM governing body obtain equal access to DMM and MSC market data and for joint authority over the approval of MSC members. If the EIM governing body has joint authority with the KISO board to approve MSC members, we recommend the EIM participating balance authority areas share the cost of hiring MSC members, and that cost-sharing information and process should be shared with stakeholders. This concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. I'll turn it to GRC members for any clarifying questions.
Rebecca, this is Doug Howe. Chloe, thank you very much for your comments. One of your first comments was that you don't support the joint authority model, but if it should go forward, then there should be a study done by KISO and the GRC on how much it will cost the California ratepayers and how that will be funded. So my question to you as the public advocate representative here is there a presumption that there will be additional costs to California? And if so, can you elaborate at all about where you see those costs arising?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think that's what we would like some clarity on. We aren't clear that it will cost, how much it will cost ratepayers if it does. And so we wanted to understand that better. So providing more information, if it will cost more, if it doesn't, if we could provide that information, that would be good too.
Tagging on, this is Valerie Fong, and thank you, Chloe, for being here and to the Public Advocate's Office for final comments. I was wondering, I think in your comments you note that one of the reasons you don't, the Public Advocate's Office does not support the joint authority model is because the EIM entities don't pay the grid management charge. But they do pay a fee to participate in the EIM based on a couple of the buckets in the real-time market. And I'm wondering why you think the GMC is such a huge issue.
Well, that's good to clarify because thanks for that clarification. Is it somewhere how much they pay, the EIM entities pay for their participation?
I'm going to turn to the ISO for where they could point Chloe to for a bit more information. I actually think even in tomorrow's governing body meeting, there's a presentation that's being put forward on the ISO's budget that includes some of the breakdown of the real-time market and which of those elements go to the EIM market. Well, that's done to the EIM.
All right, and that meeting's tomorrow?
Yeah, and so that should already be posted, but I'm going to look to folks in the ISO if they could just confirm.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone from the ISO that can or wants to answer that question? And if we don't have a quick response, then I would take that, we'll take that back and follow up with you, Chloe, unless there's someone from the ISO that's going to jump in and explain this.
Yeah, I think Peter was going to jump in, and I'm not sure if he got kicked out of the meeting, not intentionally, of course. So, Peter, did you make it back in?
Oh, hi there. Sorry, this is Peter. I for some reason got kicked out of the room there. I do apologize. I can confirm that there will be discussion on the EIM rates tomorrow at the EIM governing body meeting. We also have the presentation materials for that, as well as the allocation on how those rates are constructed and calculated. That's also posted there on the westerneim.com website, and that's available for the public today.
All right, thank you for letting us know about that.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Chloe? Okay, great. Thank you for your comments, Chloe, and hopefully we can get some more information to you to help address your concerns, and we're happy to follow up.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to jump out of order because of a time conflict, and I'm going to ask if Ali Coxlow is available to present from the subset, I guess, of the state-regulated market participants. Go ahead, Ali.
Great. Thank you so much for allowing me to skip ahead there. I appreciate it. So as Dave alluded to earlier, I am representing a subset of the current EIM entities and future EIM entities who have sort of dubbed themselves the state-regulated market participants. And that's essentially the actually also includes the California IOUs. So our group is made up of Pacificor, NV Energy, Portland, APS, Avista, Idaho, Northwestern, PNM, Puget, SCE, PG&E, SDG&E, Tucson, and Excel. So that's essentially the group of EIM entities that are both currently and planned for future participation in the EIM. And these comments are very...
Commissioner Reaper, can I make one clarification, please? Idaho Power.
Excuse me, Idaho Power.
Thank you.
We are specifically commenting on the funding mechanism for the BOSSR, so these comments will not go outside of that one topic. And I want to echo what the other presenters have said. We very much appreciate the work of the GRC and the opportunity to comment today. And we did provide this feedback at the BOSSR meeting that occurred last Friday on September 11th. So you can also access the presentation that we shared during that presentation. So essentially, the main points that we'd like to make are that we do support funding for the BOSSR. We agree that there is definitely value in greater engagement by the BOSSR in the policy initiatives, that state engagement and participation are critical components of the ultimate success of the market expansion and the full participation of the state-regulated entities. Having said that, we are not supportive of having this funding go through a CAISO tariff charge. Instead, we would propose that this be through a separate contractual arrangement that would be provided for funding. And there are a number of reasons for that. First, we see this as a faster and more efficient method to ensure funding. If we were to go through the tariff, that would require extensive stakeholder input as well as approval from FERC, and it's ultimately hard to tell how long that could take, but it could be another year before the BOSSer would potentially be able to get any funding for their participation. It's also a bit premature to put this into the tariff as we don't have a full West-wide RTO at this point. And finally, we feel that this sets an untenable precedent for the provision of intervenor funding, and therefore we would not recommend that the GRC move forward with a recommendation to place this into the CAISO tariff for a funding mechanism. There are a few things that would need to be worked out. Excuse me. For instance, cost allocation still needs to be determined, how that would be broken down by each of the utilities and states that are participating. We also need to work through some of the implementation details. For example, who would send the invoices, who the invoice would be paid to, et cetera. And there are a few other logistical components that would need to be worked out. For instance, the state-regulated market participants would be looking for positive statements from BOSSer members as it relates to recovering costs through either a general rate case or other mechanism at our public utility commissions or corporation commissions. And therefore, we would be looking for that type of not guarantee, but some type of positive affirmation that that is going to be contemplated so long as those charges are prudently incurred. And then finally, we would absolutely need very close to unanimity from the participating members of the BOSSer that this is something that they support and want the state-regulated market participants to move forward with. It would be very difficult for a certain entity to provide funding if their specific liaison to the BOSSer was not, in fact, on board with this type of funding mechanism. And I believe that is pretty much the extent of our comments. Again, we very much appreciate the work of the GRC and look forward to the continued dialogue. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Allie. Questions for Allie from the GRC?
Rebecca, this is Chris. I have a question.
Okay.
It's with regard to the request for unanimity of the BOSSer, and as most people within the industry know, the commission positions tend to roll over every 2 to 3, maybe 4 years. You get new commissioners in. To what extent does your group contemplate how to deal with a change in commissioners and perhaps a change in position on whether they necessarily agree with their state's participation in funding of the BOSSer?
So I think what we're looking for is at least an affirmation from the current member of the BOSSer that this is what they want to move forward with, and then that would kind of stand as the precedent. We have requested some type of review opportunity, potentially in 2 years, and at that point, that current member could, I suppose, voice opposition. But it would be difficult if, for instance, our current member were to leave and a new member were to join the BOSSer and they essentially said, we don't want you to pay anymore. It would be very difficult for us to continue doing that. I think really in any of the mechanisms, right? Even if it was through a tariff charge. So, that's a difficult question. I don't know that we necessarily have a great answer, but for sure right now what we're looking for is some type of positive statement from the current member.
Okay, I appreciate that answer, and my only add-on to that would be it's the distinction in unanimity versus collaboration and I can't think of the right word right now. We had it in the discussion with the bosser with Sarah. Consensus. Thank you very much. To me, it's the difference in using language of consensus or unanimity. If you have consensus, the change of a commissioner over time isn't going to change the solid support of something like that. Unanimity is tough to meet when you have a change of commissioners over time that may or may not fully understand and, you know, may raise a red flag at the very beginning. So just something for you to consider as you move forward in what position you take, if you take a unanimous or a consensus position towards the vote of the bosser now. Thank you.
Yes. I very much appreciate that comment, Commissioner Raper, and it's something that I think we've gone back and forth on, and I probably need to go back to the rest of the group to, you know, have a further conversation. Originally, we had said consensus, and I think what Sarah clarified for you at the Bosser meeting is that we're looking for something that is pretty close to unanimity in terms of at least a positive affirmation by each of the current members that this is something that they are interested in moving forward with. We might then say in our contractual arrangement that what we're looking for on a moving forward basis is that broad consensus. But if we don't, and I'm speaking right now specifically for APS, we would need for the Arizona Corporation Commission specifically to say, yes, we agree that you, Arizona Public Service Company, should pay for this service for, you know, the bosser to be supported and educated in the way that they want to be. Because if not, you know, we don't want there to be any optic issue that for some reason we are trying to pay for a service that they didn't want.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Sally. Any other questions?
This is Doug Howe.
Oh. Go ahead, Doug.
Do you want? Well, okay, thanks, Ali, for your comments. You named a number of different items that still have to be determined here. Just to get some clarity on that, are you, the state-regulated market participants, are you planning to resolve those issues? Are you turning those back to the GRC? What's the process going forward, and what is your thinking about the timing of that process?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Doug. We, at this point, are contemplating that we would now go through that process with the bosser to decide, you know, what they prefer and what types of both cost allocation they would be supportive of, invoicing, et cetera. And there is an MOU that the bosser executed with WEEB. And so right now we're in conversations with the bosser and WEEB to kind of work out some of those details. I don't know that that would really be something that the GRC needs to determine. If you kind of put forward the recommendation that you were supportive of the bosser funding and in a way that was through an outside contractual arrangement, then we would then move forward with the bosser. And to be honest, that is what we are doing anyway. As I mentioned, we did present at the bosser meeting on Friday, and we left it with them to kind of come back to us with their next steps, but that is where we left it, where we would go back and have another conversation about those things.
Therese?
Doug, Doug, my question was along the same lines, which was one of timing as we contemplate our revision. I think maybe we'll just stay connected and we'll probably be able to understand timing through Commissioner Raper, but whether there could be resolution to this prior to the next version of the document or not. I don't think there's a question there. I think there's just a comment.
Thanks, Therese. Any other members of the GRC with a question? Okay, great. Thank you for your time, Allie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Okay, next up we will move to PGP and Leah Fisher.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Leah Fisher, and I work for Public Generating Pool. So I'll start off with some opening remarks and then move into a few slides I've prepared that highlight just a couple of the key issues for PGP. But first, to start off, I'd just like to sincerely thank the GRC and the CAISO staff for their efforts to develop a governance framework that really does, I think, balance the interests of all stakeholders. We've been teasing out some areas where there are differing views today, but I think we can all agree that developing a governance framework for a multi-state market that is also first and foremost a California construct, where the participation framework and risks are different for those inside the CAISO Balancing Authority area and those outside, is really a significant challenge. So we very much appreciate the GRC taking this on. And while the GRC's proposal does not align with PGP's recommended governance framework across all issues, we nonetheless are very encouraged and supportive overall of the balance that is struck in the proposal. And I'd also just like to take a moment to acknowledge the concerns raised by some stakeholders that the non-voluntary nature of the market presents a risk to market participants within the CAISO BAA that is not shared by those outside it. So I think, to put it really bluntly, CAISO BAA participants just don't have the same option to exit the market if the governance or market design presents intolerable risks. And so we can really appreciate the concerns this raises for those that are within the CAISO Balancing Authority area. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, but also just to say that we think the CAISO Balancing Area Authority participants also have a key protection that is not shared by those outside the CAISO Balancing Authority area. And as CAISO explained in its legal analysis, the CAISO board cannot irrevocably delegate its authority and will always maintain the ultimate authority over any delegated function. So we do see this as a key protection for those within the CAISO Balancing Authority area. However, the same feature that's a protection for those CAISO BA participants, we also think represents a constraint on the durability of governance and a risk for those outside the CAISO Balancing Authority area. And while we acknowledge it's not possible to eliminate all risks associated with the governance framework for any market participant, and that would probably be a futile endeavor to try to achieve, we believe that joint authority, as proposed, is really the best model to equitably allocate risks for all participants. So our written comments outline the importance of a package of measures that we believe are necessary components within a joint authority framework. But today I'm just going to highlight a couple of those. So we can move to the next slide. Great. So this slide reflects the package of durability provisions that are included in the current GRC proposal, and those are on the left, as well as those PGP believes would further enhance durability that we recommend, and those are the ones on the right in the orange. So I'm just going to focus on one of our recommendations today, which is a dispute resolution mechanism for the governance structure itself. And to start off, I just want to note we are supportive of the GRC's proposal to enhance durability by requiring a unanimous vote of the CAISO board and taking advisory input from the governing body and stakeholders, as well as that mandatory notice period for implementing any proposed change to governance that is equal in length to the notice period for an EIM, EDAM entity to exit the market. We think those are really important protections. However, under that proposed approach, it is still possible for the CAISO board to vote and implement a change to governance that's contrary to the EIM governing body's advisory input. And while this is consistent with CAISO's legal analysis that I just discussed, where the CAISO board cannot irrevocably delegate its authority, this kind of situation would indicate significant differences of opinion among market participants. So we believe an additional step might be helpful to create an incentive to ensure all effort was taken for the CAISO board and EIM governing body to reach agreement on any changes to governance. And specifically, what we're recommending is a dispute resolution mechanism for governance changes when the EIM governing body's advisory input is different than the CAISO board's unanimous vote on governance changes. And I do want to acknowledge there could be many different ways that a dispute resolution process could work and different ideas on how to accomplish that. So our suggestion in our written comments is based on the dispute resolution approach offered for tariff rules that was in the Governance Review Committee proposal for tariff rule dispute resolution. And so it's designed to encourage working through the difference rather than having to go through the steps to implement a change that's not supported by the EIM governing body. But if ultimately this can't be achieved, our proposal would ensure that the proposed changes have been reviewed by FERC to ensure they do not run afoul of independence requirements. Next slide, please. So the second element I want to talk about briefly today is the hiring of the outside market expert for the governing body. And before I start, I just want to recognize that the Department of Market Monitoring is the only market monitor for the entire market footprint. We certainly agree with that, and we understand that the Market Surveillance Committee and DMM provide important services and information that the EIM governing body does have access to. However, both DMM and MSC have been a part of the CAISO construct since its inception, and the CAISO market was designed for California alone, of course, when it was created. And so those organizations have developed within a single state framework that has certain resource mix and specific policy goals. And as we transition to a market that will include a more diverse set of resources and multiple state interests, we really believe an outside perspective can only benefit and add value to the discussions. An outside market expert, and specifically one with experience with a diverse resource mix and within different market constructs, we think could really offer additional angles and perspectives and unlock maybe policy options and ideas that may not otherwise be considered. And just remarking, I guess, a little bit in response to some of the comments earlier today, we do not view the addition of the OME as for EIM and EDAM entities only. We believe an OME will provide value to the market and participants as a whole, and note that the analyses, opinions, and reports of the outside market expert will also be available and to the benefit of the public. In addition, I just want to point out, we do not believe the role of the OME is duplicative of the roles of DMM and MSC. As I noted before, DMM alone will hold the role of market monitor, and we envision the OME doing a bit more analysis than the MSC currently does. In particular, unique to the OME will be conducting analyses on issues identified and requested by the governing body, which is not currently a role MSC can perform or does perform on behalf of the governing body, but they do on behalf of the CAISO board. So I'd just like to expand a bit further on the reporting relationship and authority over the DMM and MSC. Our understanding is that these are tied first and foremost to the CAISO board. So really quickly, just highlighting our understanding here. So we believe the director of the Department of Market Monitoring reports to the ISO Board of Governors, and they must retain sole authority to hire and fire that position. And it is also our understanding that the budget and priority for how to use the Market Surveillance Committee is managed by the CAISO CEO. So we think these reporting relationships do impact the confidence that the governance structure represents the market as a whole. And we believe it is important to bolster the EIM governing body's involvement and oversight over DMM and MSC that's proposed by the GRC. We do support that, but we also think the outside market expert is very much necessary in addition to those roles, and at least for the first 5 years, to ensure we have fully explored and evaluated all perspectives for market design. And we think this will provide confidence that we've achieved an equitable market design for EDAM. Next slide, please. So in closing, I'd like to reiterate our support of the joint authority model. It's really based on the full complement of recommendations made by the GRC, and in particular, the proposals with respect to the OME and durability provisions. So this side, it reflects the governance framework that we support in its total proposal and total framework package. And the loss of any of these important elements would require us to reconsider our support. And just, I'd like to also thank the GRC and staff, CAISO staff again, for the great work they've put into the proposal, and express our appreciation for the BOSS's consideration of the liaison role for public power and power marketing administrations on the body of state regulators. We think this is a really great opportunity for partnership, and we're really looking forward to working with the BOSSer on the details. So I think I probably went over my 5-minute mark. Apologies for that, but thank you for the opportunity to provide our perspective on the governance draft proposal, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Leah. Therese, you can't ask any questions, but anybody else on the GRC have questions?
So this is Val, if I could ask just one question. PGP, Leah, thank you very much for making the time to meet with us today and to give us an overview of where PGP has its support and concerns. With regard to the OME, we've heard at least from at least one presenter, possibly more than one, that the OME would be redundant with the DMM and the MSC. And that, in fact, if there are entities out there that would like to see establishment of the OME, they should fund the OME. I'm wondering where PGP is on that concept.
Yeah, so I think that's a fair question to ask. And I think the way we've been thinking about it is in the same way that all market participants pay for the costs of the MSC and DMM, we believe it is also appropriate for all market participants to pay for the cost of the OME. As I mentioned in my remarks, we aren't envisioning the OME as a EIM or EDM entity only benefit. We really do see it as a role that would supplement and enhance the market as a whole on behalf of all market participants. And we certainly think that value and the cost for that should be shared equally as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions for Leah? And Therese, you can ask if you want to.
This is Andy Campbell. I have a question. Also on the topic of the OME, I appreciate the graphics and the message around the kind of independence of the OME is very clear. Could you say a bit more about the actual work, what's the work product and the sorts of problems or questions that person is, or that or the OME is working on versus the MSC and the DMM?
Yeah, sure. So I think the EDM OME would have a pretty substantial role in doing analysis. So I think we would envision presentations and advice to the EIM or EDM governing body and stakeholders regarding aspects of market design. We think they could also issue opinions on proposed market design or other rule changes. They might prepare some assessments on the performance of the day-ahead and real-time markets. But I think maybe in particular where it would be different than some of the work that's being done by MSC and DMM. So the OME would be able to also conduct analysis on issues specifically identified and requested by the EDM or EIM governing body. And so that's not something that's currently available to the EIM governing body through the MSC and the DMM. And so we think that's an important aspect that would be provided by the OME and ensure sort of the independence feature that we really believe is essential.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Leah? Okay, great. And thank you for having the slides. I like that visual depiction. It really helps.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Leah. We're going to turn to Cameron on behalf of OEA.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Before I take off my GRC hat, I did just want to thank all the previous speakers. This has been a really helpful session for me as a GRC member. That said, my name is Cameron Yurkowski. I work for EDP Renewables, the American Wind Energy Association, of which EDPR is a member, had a conflict today and could not be here to represent their own comments. So with permission from the chair, I'm going to take off my GRC hat for a moment and try to do my best to represent their written comments that were submitted. Really just one aspect of the comments in particular. I'm going to try to keep my presentation short and get to your questions and reactions from the GRC as quickly as possible. To be clear, OEA's comments were overwhelmingly supportive of the draft proposal and applauds the GRC for the work done to date. The one area where OEA did comment would fall under the other potential areas of governing body involvement. And at the highest level, the comment and the request really is in regards to promoting consistency among the terms and conditions of the various EIM entity, EIM tariff provisions. So that means looking at the similarities and the differences between the terms and conditions of each EIM entity's tariff across the footprint. If it's not clear, this is coming from a IPP perspective. Certainly, the concerns here, I believe, apply to both participating and non-participating resources. But also, I think the benefits of the consistent tariff provisions across the entire EIM footprint would benefit the market, generally speaking, and many diverse stakeholders, including third-party loads within an EIM entity's balancing area, or even potentially EIM entities themselves that have resources located in other balancing areas. So that really paraphrases Louisa's written comments, which everyone can read. The one thing that I did actually do, along with Louisa in preparation for this meeting, was to try to get some examples of the inconsistencies that are seen out there. And I'm not sure if this is an exhaustive list or even the best list, but I thought it'd be helpful for the conversation to give a more tangible flavor of what we're talking about here. So a few good examples in the area of third-party resource participation. Looking across the footprint, it sounds like there's a broad range of approaches here, whether it be requirements or restrictions. One entity, for example, requires every resource in its BA to be an EIM participating resource. And another entity isn't planning on permitting any third-party resource participation until after a certain period of time, after which only the incumbent generation has participated effectively. Now, I'm not saying I have a preference for the approach there, or that OEA does, but just illustrating really that full spectrum. A different example, under one tariff, it's currently unclear, untested, if an EIM entity would charge an incremental cost for transmission associated with the EIM dispatch. If that was true, that would be inconsistent with the reciprocity nature of transmission in the EIM. Another example, we sees differences in how losses are handled by different EIM entities in their tariff provisions. For example, one tariff removes the marginal loss component from the LMPs when it settles imbalances within its BA, whereas I believe most tariffs would include that component in the full LMP in their imbalance calculations. And lastly, that I'm aware of anyways, there are different settlement timelines and practices across the EIM entities. The higher level concern here, I think with all these examples, is that these issues and inconsistencies can potentially suppress third-party participation in the market or create inconsistent settlement results for participants, or just make it really burdensome to reconcile settlements across EIM entities. And I think especially in the context of potential EDAM, all these issues will become bigger and become much more important to ensure participation equitably and on a non-discriminatory basis across the whole market footprint. So I hope that at least clearly explains the value statement here and the interest in this topic from an IPP perspective, and I would welcome any questions at this point or even some initial reactions and thoughts I think would be really helpful to keep this conversation moving along. So thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Therese.
Thanks, Cameron. Feedback, Cameron.
Rebecca, this is Tony. A quick question just to make sure I understand the point, and I did look at the comments, Cameron. So specifically, we're talking about adding a role/obligation on both the EIM governing body and the public utility filing entity take their vote to the EIM governing body for approval before they make their 205 filing at FERC. Is that the specific suggestion?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. That would definitely be one read and one option. Careful read of the WEA comments uses different words in terms of approvals or oversight or review. I think those carry a lot of weight and obviously would be really important to the next steps here for this issue. But I think at the very least, a review and comment with respect to consistency for each tariff would seem to be appropriate.
I can't help but wonder if this is Val, if Vassar has a reaction to that, as well as, well, I mean, I know these tariffs are going to be federal, but I'm just curious what Vassar thinks of that.
Commissioner Raper, are you willing and able to respond, or is this something we should continue a conversation on?
I am on the line, but I am not in a position to speak on behalf of Vassar in that regard.
Okay, fair enough. Val, did you have a question for Cameron?
As I'm a little daunted as a member of the governing body with the proposal, but I don't have any specific question right now.
Okay. Mary Winky, I know you have a question, and I don't know if you are, nope, you are muted. Still can't hear you. Oh. No, you're still muted. I don't know how we unmute you. Okay, Mary's going to chat her question, being the resourceful person she is.
Oh, now I'm unmuted. Sorry about that. Thanks, Cameron. So I just had I think I had a question that kind of followed up on what Tony was asking, because, and I'll give you my initial reaction when I read the comments, was kind of a lot of questions just about the mechanics. I think I understand the value proposition that that is being that the ICPs are raising, but just kind of the mechanics of some type of approval process is, I would have a lot of questions about that. But specifically, are you considering that this would apply equally across FERC jurisdictional entities and non-FERC jurisdictional entities, or would this only apply to those entities actually filing tariffs with FERC? Have you thought about that distinction?
I think the value of having common tariff provisions across the whole footprint almost really requires it to apply to all the entities, which is not to say that there should necessarily be another level of FERC jurisdiction and approval here for the non-jurisdictional EIM entities. I think, the comments are more particular to governing body, board, joint authority review of the tariffs before they're filed at FERC or not, for that aspect of consistency and why there might be differences in some cases. Does that answer your question, Mary? I have a lot of questions about implementation too. I think that's where the heavy lifting is going to have to be done on this topic.
And I guess I have one more question, Cameron. Have you all thought about kind of, I do think that the EIM entities do try to work together to get to common approaches on things. Sometimes there's reasons for taking different approaches, and sometimes there's just discretion being exercised. Would you see there be some other option, sort of enhanced collaboration or using the RIF specifically more for this type of an approach, or something that doesn't necessarily equal formal approval by the governing body, but is something that is part of governance in some form.
Appreciate the thinking,
and
Mary.
You could just think about it too. That's a big question, but
yeah, no, I do appreciate it. I don't want to undercut or speak for the intent here on Leah's behalf, but I think, you know, all those options should be on the table at this point, and appreciate that comment.
Any other questions for Cameron? Okay, great. Thank you, Cameron. You may now put back on your GRC hat. And our final commenter is Meg McNall from 6 Cities. Are you available, Meg? There you are.
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Meg McNall, and I'm here today on behalf of the cities of Anaheim, Azusa, Banning, Colton, Pasadena, and Riverside, California. As many of you know, the 6 cities are owners and operators of municipal electric systems in Southern California. We're geographically located within and electrically connected to the Southern California Edison system service territory. We're load-serving entities within the CAISO. We're active market participants, both buying power from and selling power to the CAISO. And each of the 6 cities is a participating transmission owner in the CAISO with respect to certain transmission facilities and entitlements. Several of the cities are PTOs going back to 2003. Based on the 6 cities' interests, we are very actively involved in the CAISO's various stakeholder initiatives, and we are keenly interested in issues around governance review, and we believe that this is an important initiative, and so we are watching it very closely. With respect to the straw proposal, we are supportive of most of the straw proposal's key elements. We think that the Governance Review Committee has done a really nice job of balancing the competing interests of the many stakeholders who are focused on this initiative. I'd like to focus today on 2 issues in particular that we addressed in our stakeholder comments. First, we are supportive of the proposed approach for joint decisional authority as between the CAISO Board of Governors and the EIM governing body. We think that this joint decisional model should be applicable, obviously, to changes relating to market rules in the real-time market, and to the extent that the extended day-ahead market moves forward, obviously, the joint decisional approach would be applicable there as well. Because participation in the CAISO markets, as we've discussed at a couple of points during today's conversation, is not voluntary for entities located in the CAISO's balancing authority area, we think that it's important that the decisional authority of the CAISO Board of Governors be preserved. And I would reference back to some of PG&E's comments at the beginning of today's meeting regarding the potential need for a reversionary approach in the event that there is a change in the composition of the EIM such that many EIM participants do end up withdrawing. I think the topic of a reversionary interest is one that is worth pursuing, although that was not an element that we had specifically addressed in our written comments. Our support for the joint decisional model is really predicated on the idea that while EIM entities are able to mitigate risks and minimize the impact of adverse market outcomes through their voluntary participation, that's not an option that is available to entities within the CAISO BAA, such as the 6 cities. There is one nuance relating to the joint model that I wanted to touch on and that we did focus on in our comments, and that involves a situation where the EIM governing body may not wish to move forward with a potential tariff change, preferring instead to rely on the status quo, whereas you have the CAISO Board of Governors supportive of moving forward with a tariff revision. In that situation, and again, as we had articulated in our comments, we think it's important that the CAISO Board of Governors have 205 authority to proceed with that filing. Turning from the joint decisional model to another topic that has been ventilated a fair amount today, with regard to possible funding for the BOSR, the 6 cities as non-CPUC jurisdictional entities really don't have a position on whether or not the BOSR should be funded. However, we don't oppose such funding provided that it is the funding is undertaken by entities that are subject to the jurisdiction of the state regulators that are participating in the BOSR. So to amplify on that point a little bit, my clients are regulated by their local regulatory authorities, public utility boards, and city councils. So we do expend significant resources on educating those entities as to the various market issues that are relevant to the city's participation in the CAISO, and we think it would be duplicative to then also recover a charge from non-jurisdictional entities in order to fund activities of the state regulatory body. So again, no position in particular on funding, but it should not come from entities that are not state regulated. I have a couple of other observations just on issues that have come up today. First, on the idea of an independent market advisor for the EIM governing body, we did not necessarily state a position on that in our comments, but I would echo some of the observations, again, of PG&E that we do have entities in the CAISO, the DMM and the MSC, who perform those functions, and it may be an efficient use of resources to consider if there may be ways to utilize those existing forums to address whatever it may be that the EIM governing body would like to see focused on. I think it would be helpful in considering those, in considering the idea of an independent market advisor to think about whether the reasons entities would like that type of entity relate to concerns around independence or concerns around expertise. I've heard today that it may be useful to have participants advising on bilateral market-related issues, and that's not something that the MSC is historically focused on in its capacity, in its current capacity, or whether it's a resource issue. Other topics just wanted to focus on briefly. There's been some discussion about a public power liaison to the BOSR. I think we are generally supportive of that type of structure. It may be a good way to foster enhanced dialogue. But one concern or consideration to be looking at is the fact that public power is not monolithic throughout the West. We have entities like the cities that I represent who are within the California ISO and are CAISO-centric in their views, but we also have a very broad group of public power entities in other parts of the Western region whose interests may be different. So one of the challenges in navigating that liaison relationship may be figuring out who can best represent the interests of such a wide group. And I'll stop there. Thank you for the chance to address the meeting, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Meg. Any questions from the GRC?
So this is Valerie Fong. Thank you, Meg, very much. I think, am I correct? You're the last presenter, but you are a great one because you wrapped up a whole bunch of the topics here. So thank you. With regard to BOSSer representation, I think you're suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one representative from the publicly owned utilities space is going to be a difficult thing to come to, and I'm wondering, you know, as BOSSer is listening here, what otherwise would you propose?
Candidly, I don't know what the fix for that is. You know, I can understand the desire to not have sort of endless interest reflected through liaison relationships, but one approach to consider is perhaps two representatives from the publicly owned utility community, one perhaps from California and one perhaps from outside regions or that may represent the interests of EIM entities. I realize that expanding the number of participants may not be desired, but that's the solution that immediately comes to mind for me.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we just draw an east-west line somewhere in the U.S. and you get one north and one south of it. But anyway, I'm not advocating for any of this, but thank you.
Yeah, and there may be a representative who could thread that needle between the very diverse POU community in the West.
Any other questions for Meg? This is Teresa. I think I have a clarifying question. When you talked about the Board of Governors having 205 filing rights in the event that the governing body does not believe a filing should be made, so is that the situation where we built in dispute resolution, right, where we go through once, we go through twice, then we submit it to FERC? Are you suggesting we just don't go through the second round, it just gets submitted? How does your concept relate to maybe the existing proposal?
Yeah, so what I would say is that our proposal for the CAISO Board of Governors to have sort of the default 205 filing rights would be something that I think we would layer on to the proposal after the point at which the other means of trying to resolve disputes through more stakeholder processes or other consensus-based mechanisms that are described in the proposal happen and are not successful.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Any other questions?
This is Andy Campbell. I have a question.
Sure.
Could you say a bit more about why the 6 cities likes the joint authority model, including under the current kind of EIM only scenario?
So I think from our standpoint, we think it strikes the right balance. We've heard from some of the EIM entities concerns about a model that is too California or CAISO-centric, and some of the concerns about the CAISO Board of Governors statutory mandate. I think for us, we are trying to be practical in terms of recognizing that there are a large group of stakeholders that have very different positions on governance, and it seems to us that the joint decisional model provides the most practical solution to kind of navigating the different approaches that I think people might prefer. It's a good compromise.
Thanks, Meg.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at the time, 3:34. Any other questions for Meg, or is it time for me to turn it back to Therese? All right, Meg, I think you're off the hook. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the stakeholders who volunteered to give additional comment. I think as Cameron mentioned earlier, this is really helpful for the GRC. I think it just gives some depth to the comments and really makes it helpful for us in our deliberative process. So this is the point in the agenda where we're going to turn to those that are on the phone that also have comment that they would like to provide to us. If you have comment, operator, can you please tell them how they indicate they have comment?
Certainly. If you do want to make a comment, please press #2 or #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll be placed on queue and just state your name and question when your line is unmuted. Again, pressing #2 or #2 will indicate that you wish to make a comment. All right, looks like we do have a comment online. Let me open up the line.
Great.
Okay, please go ahead.
Oh, hi. Yeah. This is, first of all, a great meeting, a lot of good information. This is Elaine Ginocchio from the Western Interstate Energy Board. So I just have a comment and a question about the conduct or the decision to make meetings executive session. So I just did a quick rundown of the calendar of how many meetings the GRC has had to this point since the beginning of the year. And it looks like they've had about 23, and only 4 of those were general session. And that gives you sort of like an 80% rate of having closed executive sessions. I see the standard that you're going to be applying to have open meetings, and there are 3 reasons they do give for having closed executive sessions, and that's if the issues being discussed are around litigation, personnel, or proprietary, confidential, or security-sensitive information. So it seems like there's some room for improvement there in terms of having more open meetings. And I'm just wondering if you could shed some light on what it is that's leading you to make so many meetings executive session. I mean, is a lot of the content falling into those exceptions? So that's my question and my comment.
Thank you, Elaine, for the question. I'm going to let Roger speak to this for a bit, just in terms of open meeting rules and the decisions that we make relative to that.
Well, I can, I'll speak a little bit to that, and I'll let Bert jump in if he wants, considering he's been on more of the calls than I have. But, generally around the open meeting policy, which we do have on the website, I guess first off, I would say the reason technically, legally, it's not covered by the open meeting policy, but we did put that in our policies, and we abide by those. We put that in the charter, and we abide by those because we wanted to create as much transparency as possible on this. So we do seek to abide by the open meeting policy for that reason, and that's why we did that, because we thought it was important to have that transparency. But then when you look at the operation of how you're trying to work through a pretty large committee, and you're talking through issues that can touch on confidentiality, can touch on policies and procedures that are internal, it can touch on personnel issues as well. And I can't speak to all. I don't know if we said there was 20 executive sessions. I can't speak to each one of those. I haven't been in them. But that would be the guidance that we would follow, and we do try to follow that, again, with what we have in the open meeting policy.
And I think I hear your point, Elaine, that if we could have more open meetings, that would be appreciated by stakeholders. So we definitely hear the comment there. Are there other comments from stakeholders? Operator, are there any comments in the queue?
At this time, we don't have any other comments in queue, although I want to remind everyone, if you do want to make a comment, please press #2 or #2 on your telephone keypad.
Okay, can we go to the next slide? Here are the next steps for the committee. So what we've consistently said, I think, since about the June timeframe, is we're looking to have a revised straw proposal in the 4th quarter of 2020. and then with the goal of having a draft final proposal by Q1 of 2021. And so we will kind of take all of this information in. I think folks will have noted we do have executive session on Thursday to kind of put together a plan for how we expect to get to the revised draft proposal in Q4 of 2020. And we're going to, as we kind of put that plan together, we're going to take into consideration the schedule and approach to public engagement on this proposal and consider the timing of other things that are going on as well. So we want to be mindful of other issues that might be going on that would impact our schedule. And so we'll work through that. And then we have been giving updates regularly at the EIM governing body and at the ISO Board of Governors meetings about process and schedule and our work. And so we will do that as well once we have a formal approach to the revised draft proposal. That is all I have on next steps. Is there anybody from the GRC that wants to make any other comments or suggestions about our next steps or anything related to the meeting today? Okay, operator, do you have any other comments in the queue?
I don't see anyone with their hands raised, but if you do want to make a comment, please press #2 or #2 on your telephone keypad.
Okay. I thank everybody again for your time today. Thanks for your participation. And with this, we are adjourned for today.